Hey everybody, happy Friday. Thank you so much for tuning in to our Friends Friday cast here. We are so grateful that you spent some time with us this morning or afternoon, wherever you're at, and super excited to have Keith McCammon on the cast today from Red Canary. Keith, why don't you do a brief intro of yourself, because we're excited to have you. And really
I did. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I'm Keith McCammon, one of the co-founders and chief security officer at Red Canary. So, longtime cybersecurity wonk. Worked on offensive and defensive sides of cybersecurity for some time, and always enjoy our chats. So this is it's fun to be able to have one of those in this format. Thanks again for having me.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thanks for taking some time and spending it with us. Always, that's what we've really enjoyed about this new cast that we've been doing, is just being able to just chat with really fun and smart people. So, and appreciate you taking some time to do this for us. Today we're going to be talking kind of about adversary emulation and the goals around an adversary emulation program, in tying threat intelligence in. And then, like, how do you also utilize threat intelligence in an adversary emulation program to improve your detection and response capabilities, right? Because obviously Red Canary, very well known, especially in the MDR space. So you guys get exposed to a lot of data. So maybe tell us a little bit about kind of on a daily basis, what kind of information are you guys seeing in the world, and in even in your core service offering, but how that plays into, I guess, how it plays into the conversation today, for sure. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we and this stuff is all obviously very cyclical. So it's a fun and easy topic, and that we can kind of start anywhere and end anywhere. But
yeah,
for us, well, job one, right, is always, and I think for all cybersecurity practitioners, right, it's figure out how to find an adversary and stop them as quickly as possible, right? And so in service of that, particularly from an intelligence standpoint, we're always, like everyone, keeping an eye on news, open source intelligence, working with partners. So that's kind of I'd say the really kind of wide aperture kind of intake we deal with. And then the most useful thing for us is always going to be the first party intelligence that we produce, right? So we kind of take that wide aperture, try to figure out in the middle of that, where do we need to be in order to see adversaries in the first place, just to have visibility into the systems where they're operating, what data sources do we need. And then from there, that's kind of the bridge between, I'd say, traditional threat intelligence, and then that's how that gets kicked over into threat research, detection engineering, right? So implementing systems analytics, and ultimately putting those investigative leads in front of people where we can make good decisions. And so from an intelligence standpoint, that's we see across devices, primarily endpoints, so Windows, Mac, Linux, but the cloud control plane, identity layer in particular, which has become probably the most important, I'd say, today and moving forward. And so we see a pretty broad cross section of those, right? So customers use different technologies, usually all in those same kind of domains, right? Endpoint, identity, cloud, et cetera. But the cool thing is we get to see that, through the lens of an Okta or an Entra ID, or through the lens of a CrowdStrike or a Defender for Endpoint or a SentinelOne. And so, for us from an intelligence standpoint, just, those conversations that we've had before, just, how do you take things from as diverse a set as possible and distill that down? And to me, that's really where it gets interesting, is a community and industry is trying to figure out, we're all seeing very different things at very different stages. Red Canary will see very early stage activity. That's kind of where we play and where we really focus intently. If you turn around and look at intelligence that a Mandiant or an incident response firm produces, right, they're seeing, late stage, the intrusion has happened, usually there's been some consequence, and they're kind of working backwards. And so hopefully that's helpful framing in terms of the signal we see, but also like I'd say like where in that intrusion life cycle we kind of live and work. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's why we wanted to kind of chat, because like what we're, like I would say what is the very traditional approach of utilizing threat intelligence and like, exposure information in the world is to really help identify like, hey, do we have these IOCs in our environment, from a hunting perspective, but more traditionally, like, hey, would we be able to detect and respond if something like this got triggered? And I think that's the traditional approach, which is a very good approach for like using threat intelligence. And I think what we're seeing is like, hey, when we talk about the conversation of like moving from the reactive to the proactive, that's where it's like you can still utilize that threat intelligence, and that's kind of where the notion of adversary emulation comes into play, right?
Yep. Yeah, so. Absolutely. Yep. And from a, looking at like Atomic Red Team and things like that, right, which is like much more granular, but I'd say like a ton of the value there is in trying to figure out, hey, like, when you see a real world incident, how do you kind of abstract like that sequence of events and those things? And you can test them very individually, which I think is, that was kind of the spirit of Atomic where that started. But I think, like so much of the promise there is in figuring out how do you chain these things together in a way that like really makes it easy to understand, in a very, very practical way. Like this adversary will do these things, roughly speaking, like in this sequence, and yeah, being able to just, I'd say like make that type of intelligence more accessible, I think is like, that's like game changing for when and where we can do it. That just like that eliminates so many barriers, because it is a little, for a long time, I feel like it was a really small kind of cross section of the industry that even had that information to begin with. And now it's like anybody can have what we have, which is great. So.
Well, no, and I think that's a testament to kind of like the evolution of our field too, right? Because like, yeah, like for the longest time, we didn't have resources to really know like, hey, how do I know how these advanced threat actors are behaving, and what are the procedures that they're using to get into our, into the bigger environments or whatnot. And so now we have that, we've got minor attack, which I think is, really exploded, which is great. I'm a huge fan of it. And I know you guys are too. And then something like Atomic Red Team, where you've got the resources to actually be able to say like, hey, I could take this and actually go test for it without needing any kind of automation. Like, I genuinely can sit hands on keyboard and emulate some of these activities that threat actors are providing. What do you think was the difference, this from the threat intelligence side of like being able to aggregate more together and share it differently? Like, has it just kind of been more organic, or do you think there was something like different there?
I would say honestly, the single biggest catalyst probably, was and still is attack. Cause I think it, prior to that, again, there are a small number of shops producing, doing kind of like rigorous threat intelligence, like research and reporting, but by and large, everyone had their own language and their own taxonomy. And it was great that stuff was being published, but the barrier of entry for putting together a program that's capable of doing that is like super high. Right. And so I think that was absolutely the single biggest catalyst, was just having like that common language, but also like that, that taxonomy and that structure. And, as that's evolved over the years, I think it's just continued to make it easier and easier. Prior to that, it's, you had your ISACs and places like that, and you had a mix of kind of the commercial and open source like intelligence platforms. But it was great and it worked. But again, it just worked for such a small cross section of the industry, and like everyone else was left behind. There was no hope, right? If you're a small shop, you're not setting up a MISP instance and federating with an ISAC and doing all these crazy things, and you're sure as heck not like figuring out how to extract from that like a really easy to understand, usable adversary emulation plan. Like that was just so far beyond anyone's reach that like I think like the advent of attack and everyone kind of having that, as like an interchange format that's been game changing.
I agree. Like, I mean, and that's what I've always loved about it too, is like, from the pen tester side of the house, right? This is how we've always tried to like speak to customers or, our English or, enterprises or whomever, in that like, hey, like, while we have a lot of other things that we should be focused on from a security program and compliance and risk and governance and all this, but at the end of the day, we are in the mission of trying to identify like where we're most vulnerable, how an attacker is going to breach our environment, and what their techniques will be for like extracting information out, or whatever the crown, whatever the mission or objective may be. But so it brings that normalized nomenclature of like, hey, these are the general steps that an attacker is gonna be taking, right? Reconnaissance, lateral movement, code execution. And I think that's been, I mean, I think very influential, from the pen tester side of the house, because like that's how this is how we're trying to emulate attacks in people's environments.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. It'd be interesting to get your take on this, having done you did it before and you're doing it now, and you've kind of seen that whole arc. But one of the things that we kind of encourage, and I'd say like the mantra of like, and the spirit, I guess, of Atomic Red Team in general, not just like the open source project, is that like the best test is the one that you can do like every single day. Like, and it honestly just like establishing that drumbeat. We kind of like liken it to like healthcare, right? It's like take your vitamins, do this as often as possible. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be really complex. And I'd say, from a provider standpoint, like our customers are, a small number of them have a red team. Most of them that do any testing hire someone. And, if I think back like, 8-10 years, the most common practice was that, you got as a customer, or like as an organization, like you were exposed to as much testing as you could afford from a consulting standpoint. And so it was good that they did a red team or a pen test once a year. It's better than not doing it at all. But the problem was that like that would happen, and then 10 or 11 months would go by and nothing would happen. And when you take your report and you've got your leave behind when you finish an engagement with someone, and like, I'd say like maybe like the most game-changing thing from an organizational standpoint is like having attack, and just whether it's Atomic Red Team or not, just like so much of this tradecraft, like being exposed, making it easier to find because you can search for like a fairly specific like technique or stage of an intrusion. And now what we see is like someone hires a firm, they come in, they do the test, but like now that leave behind is like orders of magnitude more useful. And like that customer can now turn around, and 30 days later, they can go step through like all the tools, all the tradecraft, all of like the tests and procedures, like it's all right there. And so in 30 days later, they can make some improvements, and they can literally go and like effectively like redo, like they can reproduce your work.
Yep.
And like that is like, that alone is like game changing, right? It's like you're no longer, the testing you can do is no longer a function of just like dollars you can throw at a third party. And like, that's, even if you don't have a big, super experienced internal team, like that barrier has just come way down.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, no, I mean, that's what we've kind of been we've been preaching for a long time, is like one, being able to move from a reactive state to a proactive state. And then, shortening the cycle on how quickly you can identify what you should be testing and testing for it on a regular basis, right? Yeah, it is that daily hygiene kind of apple a day type of a thing, and that's what I've loved about Attack and even Atomic Red Team, is that it provides those you can go as broad and wide and deep as you want, or as narrow as you need to, and you don't have to have 100% of the skill sets as like a seasoned veteran red team or in a pen testing team to be able to at least identify some of the things that you probably know you should be fixing, right? So like, and I have a prime example of this. When I was a security director before we started PlexTrac, we did it. It's very similar. We kind of went into this mindset of like being in an agile framework, and so hey, we want to do some testing on a regular basis because like this was still like what I knew we should be doing, right? So I'm like, hey, how can we get kind of into this mindset? So every 2 weeks we were focused on a general tactic, like okay, within lateral movement, like we feel like one, we kind of knew our environment well, so it's like, hey, we have a general idea, of where our gut feel is, like where we might have some weaknesses, right? So we started with lateral movement, right? And it's like, hey, let's just test, let's do as much of lateral movement testing as we can in this 2 week sprint, and then see where we're at, and so it's so much more informative because then it's like, okay, yeah, hey, we actually identified some gaps and we'll go fix those now. And so rather than like waiting an entire year, especially between like, if you have a yearly pen test, still good to do, to get fresh eyes on things, but like the techniques and procedures that change between 1 year to the next can be so drastic, and so variant. You're not truly preparing yourselves, right?
Yeah, but I'd say there's also there's like a counterpoint to that too, which is that for every one of those things that does change, I'd say there's also a lot that doesn't. And I think that point like that you make, which is take it's kind of like this picture that I always draw when I like do these talks, but it's like, take a big thing you're worried about, like a ransomware or an account compromise. And then for us, we break that down into threats, right? Which is kind of like, that's the next level. And so a threat might be a tool like a Cobalt Strike or something like that. Or a threat might be a group or an adversary, right? If they have a name. But then what we're always looking for in our own reporting and everyone else's is like then breaking that down and just going, hey, from the earliest sign that this threat is materialized in your environment, like what are the first behaviors, signals you're going to see? And like, I love the idea of just like you box that in and say, hey, like we're working right here, like earliest stage sign that we've got this thing showing up. Let's just spend a week on it. And that's that's always going to be an interesting mix. Like those techniques don't really drift much year over year. We've talked a ton about this, right? Like those top 10, 15 techniques that we see show up like day after day after day, like those things there's not a ton of drift there. Even when you look back 3, 4, 5 years, the procedure, like the implementations change,
right?
Often slightly, sometimes significantly, sometimes slightly. And that's where all the variability takes place. But if you kind of like, if you can take that and just box it in and say, hey, cool, we're working on, very early stage, initial access, here's the threat, here are the techniques. And that makes that super approachable, man. And and then you just step through. And when you get to the end, sure, just like start back at the beginning, things will have changed.
Yeah.
So great.
And that's where the threat intelligence actually comes really handy from the proactive side, is like, hey, not only like this procedure has changed, right? Like it's the same general tactic of Privesk and same general technique of like using PowerShell or something like that, but the actual command or the prompt or like the vector may be slightly different, and that's where threat intelligence can actually inform you to say like, hey, like we've been testing for this, like just throw this one now into the mix, right? So.
And I think the one of the things that that's always excited me about what you all have done from a product standpoint even is just like the systems approach to doing that. And just you do your test, you have your findings, and then most importantly you have the things that you need to change, right? Like, and what's really interesting, I'd say the organizations that do that, right, that are like taking their vitamins, doing testing regularly, every year when we put out our threat detection report, like the single biggest observation is like, hey, there are some new things in here, but like keep an eye on what didn't change. And if you're doing that testing and then saying, hey, cool, like we've got a visibility gap here. Like there's a set of signal we need that we're not getting. And like taking that finding and peeling it out and making sure that like, that's the thing that you focus on. Once you do that, like it's amazing. Like your defensibility forever is leveled up incredibly. And just taking that approach of like, really breaking down time box or like isolate your tests, focus at a particular area, but then like really like take a rigorous approach to like root cause analysis. Like, why did we not see this thing? Or how could we have seen it sooner? How could we have like shortened our time to respond to that? And even if you're just doing that like once, right? Like just that level of like rigor and just like good incident management, honestly, right? Just like seeing an incident through, but like really focusing on like visibility gaps, vulnerabilities, whether it's software configuration, human, right? And once you've closed those, like, I think it's like, what's really interesting. And I think most organizations still aren't to the point where they're doing that. But like, once you do that and like that flywheel starts to engage, like you're closing like really small gaps from that point forward. It doesn't take very many of those findings to really like, you've made it so much more difficult for like any adversary to operate, like not just that threat, but like most threats are going to use a common set of initial access techniques, right? No matter who they are or what they are. And as you start to close those gaps and like build some rigor in there, you just find that over time, like you have like really built something that's like pretty difficult to evade. And it's, like there's just a ton of promise there. And I just like, if anything, it's like, how do we get more people to do that? Even if they only do it, maybe not every week, but like, even if you do that once a month, like your ability to like defend against like even a sufficiently like advanced adversary is just like, it's game changing forever.
I'd be curious your thought, because like, I'd say like on the detection and response, there's a lot of time spent into like, how would we detect if this thing happened in our environment, and what would our mean time to response or, remediation be? I'd be curious, like, tying that back into the proactive side, because I'd be curious your thoughts and like advice on how you can do that. And I have some thoughts of my own, but I'd love yours.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not 100% certain I kind of understand the question there, but like, I think,
I guess what I was saying is like, we spend a lot of time, like security teams spend a lot of time on the detection engineering piece, right? Like kind of configuring those IOCs to like, hey, if this happens, we know we'll get an alert, right? And like, what would be your advice of like, spending as much time on the proactive side as we do on the detection and response side?
I got it. Yep.
Yeah.
This is, first of all, I'd say taking an engineering driven approach to that is absolutely the right way, right? That's how you do like just ensure continuous improvement, but also, to your point about like, how do you kind of balance the proactive and the reactive, right? I mean, I'd say like one of the things that like we've always felt super strongly about is like we spend, I'd say, as I would hypothesize that like our team, detection engineering team, spends easily as much time on testing and like writing tests as we write analytics, and then just continuing to like pressure test in those areas where we do expect that like adversaries are just going to continue to like incrementally like innovate or just like evolve within a technique space. I mean, 50-50, I think, is actually like a great and very realistic rule, right? I think there's, I think for a long time, the mindset was like, just keep cranking out more analytics, keep tuning them. And that's super dangerous, right? In a bunch of ways, like, one of our kind of like deeply held beliefs is like, we actually want our analytics to be fairly broad. Like we're fine with false positives or, and then we just, you build a workflow and a system that makes it easy for an analyst to make a decision and say, hey, this is okay because, and you codify that and that goes back and kind of feeds into the machine. But like, you don't want to spend all your time just writing more analytics and trying to tune those things to the point that they're surgically accurate, because by definition, like if you've got an analytic that's surgically accurate, like it doesn't take much of a change for that thing to fail. And so, to start to just, you may never see it again. And so, so taking that approach where it is like, yeah, cool, get a bead on the adversary, ensure you've got good visibility, build your detection, at a technique level that's practical given like your platform and your constraints. But then most of your time shifts immediately into like that proactive stance where like, let's write tests for this thing. Let's start thinking about like, where are the permutations going to be? Where are the changes? Like if you're looking at PowerShell command lines, like there's a whole world like that's effectively like its own like complete language. You can do all these different things, and there's 1,000 ways to do any one thing. And so you almost have to, like, once you get a bead on a technique, particularly one that is going to be like highly prevalent, like spend almost as little time as possible writing analytics and trying to select out data, and spend as much time as possible like focusing on like being proactive, testing, both like from a software like detection engineering standpoint, like make sure you've got regression tests built in, make sure you've got unit tests built if you're doing that at scale, but also just the very applied testing, right? Like go and run these things, read new intelligence, like throw as many things like into that system, like fire as many tracers as you can, and make sure that when that it's going to work when it matters, right? And that's kind of
thing. Yeah, exactly. And that's my opinion too. I mean, as spending as much time on the detection and response, capabilities for alerting should also be spent on, hey, actually identifying if you have the gaps, right? And what the variance could be, like, as you said, in terms of like, hey, they may be running this command. If our detection signature or whatever, like, carbon black or, in whatever system is saying like, hey, this is the way that it's going to be run. If we tweak it at all, or like change the encoding on the, the payload, does it still fire, right? So it's like you can still be. I would suspect that there's a lot of testing being done around the alert firing, as opposed to like, that's great. I mean, you still want to know if the alert fires, but also like, are you actually testing for the gaps that you have in the environment, right?
The key to incident response is knowing you have an incident in the first place, right? Like it is really easy to fixate on like the more mechanical stuff, and like you kind of lose sight of the fact that like, hey, like what if we did, like, you might have a perfect analytic and you might feel really good about your detection in this area, but like, a whole, so that fundamental like red team philosophy, which extends very much into like purple teaming now, which is great. Like that more collaborative version of it is like test, like really pressure testing that hypothesis. All right, cool. So we feel great about this super early stage signal and our detection, and we know what to do. Like now let's play it out. Like let's pretend they find another way in entirely. Like what's the next thing they're going to do? And do we feel as good about that as we feel, about thing B as thing A? And like that, and that only comes through just like constant experimentation and like being super proactive, and like really, really like a mindset that's like very focused on like just assuming that any one of those stages, processes, opportunities, like assume any one of them will fail,
right,
and make sure the whole system works. And that's kind of, I think, like that right there is like the difference between like doing atomic testing and doing detection engineering at a granular level, which is important, but like adversary emulation and the importance of it is that like that just plays out the whole attack from start to finish with as much variability as you can afford to introduce over time, and make sure like if the whole system doesn't work, none of the system works. Right? And so like you gotta make sure that if you miss a thing here, that like you feel good about your opportunity to pick it up at the next stage.
Yeah. Well, and I think just even having some level of comfort or not in terms of like, hey, here's how we're making progress, right? Like, hey, last year we were not, anywhere close to being able to detect anything related to privilege escalation. Now we can detect it. Maybe next year we could actually prevent it,
Yep.
And so being able to test it on a regular basis is is that iterative process as well, from both the defensive side and, or the reactive side and the proactive side. So
yeah, that is we haven't really talked about that at all, but it is, moving upstream, like the always refer to, detection is critical. Like if you can only do one security operations thing really well, like it's got to be detect and respond, right? And then you kind of like you evolve out from that. It's like concentric circles kind of. But that is, like, glad you called that out, because the ideal situation is like you learn enough about that attack surface that you figure out how to mitigate it and you take it away, right? And it's like Casey Smith and I did a fun talk years ago, and we just kind of talked about the concept of like battlefield shaping. Like the real goal in all of this is not to get great at diving saves. Where like, we've built a ton of detection coverage at Red Canary. Like that is our bread and butter. Like be better at detecting things that like everything else has missed. And that's kind of where we operate. But those are diving saves, right? Like every single one of those is like a miss away from an adversary making it one step further. And now like every step further, like every step that they progress, like stakes are higher, you're working harder to find them, scope that intrusion, mitigate it. And really what we want, it's like when you talk like adversary emulation and just like systematizing that, like that's the holy grail, is like move that upstream and get to the point where you're taking as much attack surface away as possible, force the adversary like into these choke points that you can defend really well, understand really well. Like you can, like, how to respond, and you can really operate almost with a hair trigger when things go bump. And like that concept of battlefield shaping, where it's like just steer the adversary into the small number of places that you can just watch like a hawk, and like you know them better, you understand what normal looks like, and when things go sideways, like you can just respond with a ton of confidence. And like that's like once you're at that point, like you're really like now you're doing some really cool stuff, like doing detection on the margins. Like you can really innovate from a detection standpoint. Just because like you've taken away so many of those options and like that adversary's like ability to maneuver.
Yeah. I mean, obviously we've already gone like half an hour just riffing on this. Like, like I think we knew we could talk a lot about this kind of stuff, because I think we're both obviously super passionate about it. So, but yeah, so I mean, like, kind of land the plane. Like, what would be some of your advice to folks to like, hey, how do you get started, or what's the best way to start gaining more visibility and taking some threat intelligence into a proactive state? Like, what would be your
from a proactivity standpoint, I think, and I think how this conversation came about was us trying to figure out, hey, how do we aggregate, normalize, share more intelligence across the whole industry, and then get it into the platforms that folks are using to like prioritize their work, to do purple teaming, and to like, again, like systematize their security operations. And I think the, proactivity in general, it's like the number one thing I always kind of like recommend is like just, take in, like, there's great sources of free intelligence. Take even a few of those and just figure out, like, you can make a really short list. Like the number of initial access, like vectors have not changed much in 5 or 10 years. They trade places, right? With the exception of like the SolarWinds year where you had the big supply chain blip, but like it's phishing, it's vulnerabilities. Like figure out how folks are getting a foothold in the first place. Like instrument as much visibility as you can there, and then take all of this great open source intelligence that's available, figure out again, like those small number of techniques in each of those areas, to your point, right? Just box them in. Like, don't worry about all the other things that could happen and all the other, like, there will always be more ways, but like, I think just very granularly stepping through that, like, how are they getting in the first place? Are we instrumented there? Do we have visibility? And then what are the most prevalent techniques? Again, not a ton of drift there year over year over year. And just keep that flywheel moving. And like every single time you as a purple team, like you find a gap or you find a failure mode, like fix that. And I feel like everyone, like none of us appreciate fully, or not many folks appreciate fully, like the massive gains you make, and just like how much you increase the cost to the adversary and kind of just introduce friction in their process, and it make your organization so much more defensible. Like those are just like the benefits are so additive over time, that you're in a terrific position. But it is just like one thing at a time, and like ruthlessly prioritize for what's common. Do not worry. Like there will always be O days. There will always be apex adversaries. Like there will be the Stuxnets of the world and things like that. But like that is not what 99.99% of us need to show up at work every day and like worry about and instrument for and find and respond to. So
yeah. No, good stuff. And I think like my advice also is, when people ask is like, hey, don't feel overwhelmed too. It's like you said, starting somewhere and doing something every day is better than nothing, right? And it's kind of similar to like, the way you lose 20 pounds is you start on day one. You just take a day at a time. It doesn't happen overnight, right? So,
yeah, get up and take a walk, man. That's
walking
every single day.
Eat a little less, or something like that. So, well, hey Keith, so much. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. Super engaging conversation. Tell us a little bit more about, obviously I know what you're working on, but tell us for the audience and then how people can find you and whatever else. So.
Yeah. We're still working on Red Canary. We're going strong. I will say, like, it's, to the point of like what I've been working on, and I think, and I hope where like a lot of this dialogue leads is just like always working on ways to figure out like how can we learn from our peers and others in industry, and like how can we, what do we know, things that we're seeing, doing the hard way, like can we short circuit that learning process or help other people get the benefits of that? And so so much of like, what I enjoy working on and what we've been working on is just trying to figure out like how do we get more kind of data, insights, intelligence like flowing freely, like not just like from Red Canary to the public, but to like others like yourselves, and like continue to lower the barrier of entry, like product integration, community building, threat intelligence, like being able to share that stuff and make it super actionable. That's where we're spending a lot of our time right now. So.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks so much again. Definitely appreciate the great conversation. Definitely check out Keith on LinkedIn. Same with Red Canary. They're a great group of folks. We love working with them, and obviously love working with you, Keith. So thanks again. Happy Friday, everybody. We wish you the best, and hope you guys all have a great weekend, and hopefully you learned something. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the chat, and we will try to respond as soon as we can. So.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Dan. Really appreciate it, man. This was a super fun format and conversation. So
yeah.
Have a great weekend.
Thanks. You too.
Cheers.